It's so great to be here. That was really nice. Thank you. Yeah, I have a lot of connections actually. The first thing I ever did, I came out of Berkeley with a law and regional economic development degrees, and was a lawyer for a while, working on class actions. But then I decided to pivot to policy, and the first thing I did actually was run an organization called the Apollo Alliance, which you may remember Lucy Blake used to run here in California. So I actually worked for Lucy very early in my career, 25 years ago now. So a lot of connections with this region and a lot of love for this region. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what Steve was just saying, which is just what we at California Forward, and this has sort of been a journey of mine for many, many years, reframing a little our approach to climate action here in California, moving from what has been a very successful climate action through regulation primarily approach to something that's more holistic and more integrated, because there's issues that we're dealing with that just are not captured well by the regulatory system. Wildfires is one of them. We're really proud to be on the Wildfire Solution Coalition, but so are a bunch of other things. How do we think about economic transformation? How do we think about the need for growth in a number of industries, right? While we're trying to curb emissions. How do we think about shared prosperity and really creating opportunities across California? One of the things I love about California Forward, which kind of is this interconnective tissue between the regions and the state, is that we have a long history of being focused on both regional voices in Sacramento and really, I would say, particularly inland and rural because of the lack of capacity in these places, but also we're very focused on this idea of stewardship. It's something Steve has taught me a lot about, but the idea that in California, you really can't talk about climate or the economy or a future without thinking about the relationship with the land. And how do we steward our resources? How do we steward our land? How do we think about balance in all the things that we're trying to do? So I'm going to talk a little bit about context for the work, a little bit about the work, and then a bit to Steve's request about what's happening in California right now, which is a lot. I think you have to think about these issues in a global context. I'm actually just looking around this room and like sustainable aviation fuel is a global issue. Like there are global supply chains. There are things to think about that are much bigger than this region, right? But we're thinking about here, wildfire, climate impacts, global context. Many of the technologies you all were just talking about in terms of weatherization, in terms of electrification, are supply chains that go beyond this region, right? And this state. So we really do have to talk about the global context whenever we talk about anything having to do with the economy, and fundamentally what the climate imperative is an economic transformation. It's a transformation of our entire system from one that was built at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are part of absolutely every part of the economy. And how do we think about a wholesale transformation of that? We're doing that in the context of some really big shocks to that system, right? I mean, we're experiencing, and have for the last couple of decades and beyond, but really profound shocks from geopolitics, just a change in the world order, frankly, from where we were post-World War II to a really different place today in terms of America's role, but also Europe's role, our relationship with China, a number of things, huge impacts on supply chains, huge impacts on this conversation. Economic shocks, COVID, first of all, the Great Recession, COVID, just ongoing economic shocks, inflation, and then just these increasingly severe and frequent climate shocks to the system. Steve talked about the Risky Business Report, which I did with Hank Paulson and Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg to really try to highlight this is not just a sort of a side chief sustainability officer issue, right? This is a deep financial issue to the United States. So all of that context has kind of brought us to an interesting place where to some extent there's new will for that transition. For sure, that new will is not being felt in Washington right now. It really was when I was there. It is not right now. But I think a lot of will on the ground in a lot of state and local will. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the shocks. I said a little bit about this before, but honestly, both COVID and the Russia-Ukraine conflict are a very big deal for kind of the energy transition conversation. COVID, because I was in the governor's office at the time, and it really underscored for us. I mean, all of a sudden our supply chains all broke down, remember, at the beginning of COVID, and it reminded us that we were super dependent on global supply chains, that we had not built up our domestic supply chains, and we weren't particularly resilient as a result. Russia, Ukraine, super, super important, drove a significant amount of the new gas production that's happening in the United States. That is a big deal. It's a big deal not only US-wide, but it's a big deal in California as a state that still does have oil and gas production. This is a boat on fire in the South China Sea. This is increasingly Houthi attacks on the oil supply chains, increasingly becoming an issue for fossil fuels and something that we have to think about as drivers of this transition. So all these things, they're not about the Paris Agreement. They're not about greenhouse gas reduction, but they're about shocks to the system that are driving us to have to become more resilient, right? More diversified, more localized, more resilient. At the same time, you are up here, I mean, ground zero of the climate shock. So I don't have to talk that much about it. But at the same time, seeing these increasingly expensive and dramatic shocks to our current system, the current state budget deficit is in large part due to the LA fires. Because of Palisades being the neighborhood with the single most people on the FAIR plan in California, which means we're bailing out, that's public dollars to the FAIR plan, public dollars to disaster recovery, public dollars to relocation, public dollars to unemployment claims, on and on and on and on, right? These things are going to keep happening. So shocks to the system, driving us in a direction. You've got economic and energy transition right in the middle of that. The shocks to the system are addressed to some extent through this huge economic transition. It doesn't mean it's easy, but it does mean that there's a lot of increasing drivers to do it. We sometimes think about what that looks like. Like, what do we mean when we say we want to build a clean energy economy? What does that transition look like? And if you do a Google search, like, you get these like visions of the future, right? You're like, oh, there's a couple turbines, there's some houses, and that's an EV, and everyone's happy. And it doesn't underscore the hard reality of the trade-offs of this transition, which is that that's really what it looks like to a great extent. It looks like new industry making those electric cars. It looks like 80% of every turbine is steel. Where's that coming from? It looks like new flows of infrastructure, new ways of doing agriculture and other resource economies, timber. It looks like direct, on the bottom, that's direct air capture. It looks like removing some of that carbon from the atmosphere to deal with just this fact that we've, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, been putting carbon in the atmosphere, so we got to take some of it out. It is still an industrial economy. The clean energy economy is still industrial. Really hard for us to get our heads around because it opens the door to a ton of trade-offs that we have to talk about all the time. It also means land use change, right? I mean, one of the big things about California and carbon is that our biggest carbon impact is in transportation, and a large chunk of that is because of how much we drive. It's the vehicle miles traveled, it's the scale and scope of the state, it's massive. There's not a lot, we have not done development patterns particularly efficiently for the last 100 years. So it requires thinking about trade-offs on the land side. Every big solar array takes a bunch of land. Wind takes land. Transmission, if we're going to increase our transmission to deal with increased electrification, increased air conditioning, and climate adaptation, and AI, obviously, the other big conversation, we have to something like triple our transmission infrastructure in the state, or make it much more efficient. I mean, there's ways to do this. Think about agriculture, think about these resource economies, they've got to change. We have to reimagine our resource economies to think about what they look like in this moment where we're just constantly balancing all these things to try to address our climate challenges. So this is a sort of a big rethinking. And I'm saying this to say all the local decisions we're making are in this context of a big rethinking because carbon emissions do not stay local, right? 2 weeks or so is how long carbon stays in the atmosphere here. That when you release carbon here in this area and then it goes global. So this is a global issue with local solutions. And so that constant conversation between global and local is incredibly important. So we at California Forward, and Steve said this, and I've been doing a lot of work on this. If you have looked at any of the stuff we've been writing, we really think it's time to shift the frame from what we've been doing for the last couple of decades, which is essentially since, AB 32 back in 2006, which is essentially saying we have a bunch of really good environmental regulation that deals with local pollution. Let's use that to regulate carbon. So let's say carbon is like a local pollutant. Let's treat emissions like pollutants. Let's balance emissions. Let's reduce them over here. Let's count them over here. Really, really good set of structures. We are world leaders on this, right? Like we've gotten really far with this. But we're now at a point where counting carbon like a local pollutant creates these weird incentive structures. So for instance, like if I have a closed, I won't say coal plant here, but if I have a closed like refinery in California and it's not doing anything, it's closed, it closed down, and I want to build a battery manufacturing there, or I want to build some kind of bioeconomy non-combustion facility there or something, I want to put some industry there that's part of an EV, like I want to build an EV factory there, whatever. If I build on that site, I'm increasing emissions under the carbon, right? I'm not dealing with the larger systemic problem. I'm on that site in this context, increasing emissions. We have to start looking beyond that to a more systemic approach. So that's a lot of what we're working at California Forward, is really this idea of moving toward sort of a climate smart economy, away from climate regulation as the only tool toward a much broader set of tools. What does that look like? I'm going to skip a bunch of slides. Well, first let me say why we're doing that. First, regulating just for those, as if carbon's local emission doesn't deal with that economic policy, doesn't deal with these system-wide investments we need to make. It also doesn't deal with inequality. Inequality has increased the entire period of our carbon regulation. That is not causal, but it's another perverse incentive. If we offshore our manufacturing, we look great on the left, and we look bad on the right? Like taking away all of those middle skill jobs, not great from an inequality perspective, great from a low carbon is a local emissions perspective. So something just to think about. We have invested very heavily in a low carbon knowledge economy that looks great from an emissions standpoint. It looks a little less great when you think about creating a lot of tech jobs with really high incomes and then a lot of really low incomes in service and retail. Not a lot of economic diversification, a lot of warehousing, because of taking away some of those local production abilities. So this is not necessarily a great look from a climate perspective or a quality of life perspective, but it does look good on the modeling. So how do we get beyond the modeling? There's a lot of disparity across the state. I think you all know that. It also doesn't address climate risk. Generally, our climate regulation in California has looked at emission reduction as the metric, not at risk reduction, not at resilience, not at adaptation investment. Those are things that are increasingly important, and they're increasingly important not just because of the impact on our daily lives, but because like our budgets are being spent on this. I mean, this is where all the money is going. These are billion-dollar disasters. We are particularly at risk in California. A lot of these disasters, we're having more and more of them. Every flood, every fire, every mudslide, sea level rises, that ongoing thing, extreme heat have real economic consequences. Today, the 99% of those costs and risks are borne by the government, which means all of you and all of us, taxpayers, ratepayers. And this is an incredible issue. So what do we think we should do about it? I'm going to go through these. So we've been doing a ton of stakeholder interviews as part of kind of a climate smart economy project that we're doing with the Resource Legacy Fund and some other folks. Key takeaways, we got to keep playing a leading role. We've talked to a lot of people across the state. We have the ability to make a difference, but also not addressing this in a more systemic way is eroding our political will across the state for climate action. We're starting to see economic anxiety, particularly around affordability, causing a lot of concerns about some of our climate policies. We're starting to see that we're not delivering on building the new economy that we need to build. We're starting to see, obviously, massive federal attacks on the whole regulatory system, meaning we have to look for new tools. We're seeing inadequate action on adaptation. The climate bond was amazing. Thank you to everybody who got that passed. Dealing with resilience and adaptation through occasional bonds is, to Steve's point, not going to cut for the cost of these things. And we're starting to see what some people are calling a retreat on climate. I'm not sure it is a retreat, it's a debate we can have, but just a broadening of the aperture, I think, is where we're getting. So we need to get beyond regulatory policy alone, though not abandon it. And what does that look like? It looks like a lot of things that are happening right now in California that are super interesting and kind of highlight the trade-offs. And I'm going to talk about those in a second, but first I'm going to say, as we think about broadening the aperture and thinking about climate as an economic agenda, we have to be aware of the context of economic planning in California. Stephen and I, through the California Stewardship Network, do a lot of work on this. California is the only major state with no economic development agency. GOVIS is not an agency that has a legislatively confirmed secretary. It is a super important advisory arm of the governor's office, but it's not an agency, which means, unlike Texas, unlike New York, unlike Ohio, we don't have a state agency with regional offices where there's economic development folks in every region thinking about how the state's economic priorities intersect with regional priorities and thinking about how to build, sort of do deal flow, figure out how to drive investment, figure out how to deal with some of these trade-offs on the ground. That feels to us in California Forward in the CSN and then Stewards are going to look like a big missing piece. And we're doing a lot of work right now to think about what a plan for the next governor might look like to address this issue. What we do have is sort of some systems that aren't super durable and don't exist everywhere. California Jobs First was formerly the the Community Economic Resilience Fund. I was honored to write the first version of that when I was in the governor's office, very involved in creating that with a lot of partners. It was our goal of trying to get around this issue. We were like, we don't have this, so let's give regions the ability to plan. It's great. It's got some warts. It is not durable. It's not in law. I mean, it's going to end. It's going to sunset. And it's taking on a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole puzzle. We have the state metropolitan transportation agency and council of government system doesn't cover every part of the state, including up here, right? We have these. This is what you see if you go to the Federal Economic Development Agency website. This thing on the right. Every other state has state government office, regional offices. We have state government office, bunch of things, including Sierra Business Council, which is great. Doesn't cover the whole state, not part of the state apparatus. So really, this is a context in which we're planning. We also are planning in the context of a super volatile budget. I think you all know this. California's budget relies extremely